Welcome everyone, both our guests and our panel, to our session, How to Build and Implement a Framework for Racially Equitable Mobility. We're really excited to talk with you guys today, and we're really excited to be a part of this wonderful conference that I think all of us love every year. So thank you for being here. Um, my name is Sahar Shirazi. I'm a principal and co-lead of the emerging mobility sector for Nelson Nygaard, which is I'm based in Oakland, but we are a national and sometimes international practice that works with communities to drive outcome-driven results in mobility and planning. Um, we, sorry, our panel today is going to be a 1-hour session. We'll have just some brief introductions as well as some slides to talk through some of the materials today. We will leave time at the end for questions and answers from the audience, and we'll precede that with a little bit of a moderated discussion between our panel experts that we have here. I would love, we do have a Q&A option for at the end of the event. If you have questions as we're going through, feel free to put them in that box as well. And in the meantime, as we're going through our introductions, it would be great to get a sense of who's in the room. If you want to use the chat function to just say your name and where you're coming from. So in terms of agency or private sector or what have you. Sorry, not your background and life story, although we would love that if we had more time. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and introduce our panelists. We have a really amazing crew here today. I'm so excited to be able to moderate this panel with these great women. I'll start with Naomi Doerner, who is the Director of Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion at Nelson Nygaard. She is a nationally recognized transportation equity and mobility justice strategist with expertise facilitating and implementing institutional changes at organizations and agencies and institutions so that communities of color can thrive. Naomi has over 15 years of experience working with public sector staff, government agency leaders, elected officials, and community-based organization. Before she joined us here at Nelson Nygaard, Naomi served as the Seattle Department of Transportation's and also the first in the nation's Transportation Equity Program Manager. She's also the co-founder and national co-organizer of The Untokening, which is a multiracial collective of leaders advancing mobility justice, a Robert Wood Johnson Foundation Culture of Health leader, and Next City Vanguard alum. Naomi lives here in Oakland, California. We're very lucky to have her both locally and on this panel. Next, we have Laura Stuchinsky, who is the Emerging Mobility Program Lead for the San Jose Department of Transportation, which is the project that we'll be talking through a bit today. She's also the project manager for the city's Emerging Mobility Action Plan, which is a year-long planning effort to determine if and how emerging mobility can help create a transportation system that is affordable, sustainable, safe, reliable, and accessible to all. San Jose's DOT, under Laura's guidance, is centering racial equity in this planning process as they move forward. And finally, last but not least, we have Tamika Butler, who is a national expert and speaker on issues related to the built environment, equity, anti-racism, diversity and inclusion, organizational behavior, and change management. As the principal and founder of Tamika Butler Consulting, she focuses on shining a light on inequality, inequity, and social justice. Most recently, she was the Director of Planning, California, and the Director of Equity and Inclusion at Tool Design. And prior to that, Tamika served as the Executive Director as the Los Angeles Neighborhood Land Trust, which is a nonprofit organization that addresses social and racial equity and wellness by building parks and gardens in park-poor communities across the greater Los Angeles region. Tamika lives in Los Angeles with her wife, son, and daughter. So as you can see, we have a pretty amazing panel here to talk through some of these very complicated and important issues today. So I want to just open up with a brief discussion on why this is important. Not that I think we have any doubters in this crowd, however, we really want to discuss why we're talking about racial equity in the context of transportation, particularly in the emerging mobility sector. Emerging mobility at this point has become second nature to many of us. However, it's still fairly new as a practice in terms of the effects it could have, the impacts it could have, and the opportunities that it can increase. So we want to really start by acknowledging some of the past mistakes we've made, some of the past harms that we've caused in the transportation and planning world, and who was most impacted by those. Uh, Understand that as we move forward, we can learn from those mistakes and try and do better. But this is a practice, it's not perfection. We don't have the answers. We know where we've gone wrong. We don't know all of the ways we've gone wrong. And we really want to think of this as a learning process for everyone as we continue to grow and evolve in terms of equity. Part of that is relationship building as well as relationship repairing. Building is going to be happening over a continuum, and it is complicated, and it doesn't always align with the more linear practices and processes we have in planning, and we're going to talk a little bit about that today. We're also going to talk about some of the inherent tensions that exist between what cities or public agencies need and what communities need or want, and how those are expressed. Often on the city side, those are expressed in terms of key performance indicators that tend to be a bit more technical and quantitative than the ways that we might express things in community-driven forums. They can be a little more focused on stories, personal stories, lived experiences, and qualitative aspects. So that creates some natural tensions, and those are overlaid on top of the tensions that are already going to exist in terms of the processes we've been using in the past. So we really want to start with that and start with unpacking some of our assumptions, understanding that there's a lot we think we know, but there's a lot that we don't know. And all we know is that we're learning as we move forward. And part of that is taking a step back in understanding that we just don't have all the answers. So with that, I am going to get us started with Naomi Doerner and talking a little bit about some of her past work and current work. Naomi?
Great. Thank you, Sahara, for framing us up. I am going to talk a bit about the work I do and just frame up why it is that the approach that I take and that we at Nelson Nygaard take and that this project is taking is leading with race. And then we'll talk about the project. Laura will actually give us a great overview of it itself, as well as our partners that Tamika will talk about. But first, yeah, why do we lead with race? And if you really think about how our systems are designed, but even more basic than that, really, like how you know we interact in our communities and just the patterns and the outcomes that we see as it relates to who's benefiting and who's not benefiting. There is a really clear indication from data, and also I don't want to dismiss, right? Data is very important, but from the stories, as Sahara was saying, right, from the experiences, from the truths that people express and live. I myself am Latinx. I grew up in Chicago and then Atlanta, and the experiences that myself and my mother had at a very young age, navigating the city and getting around, were very different than the kinds of experiences that I now have. I think in part that is some of it is privilege, places I now get access to and live, and the fact that I'm light skinned, right, and I'm not traveling with my mother, who is very dark skinned, as I did with her when I was a child. These characteristics, right, like race, ethnicity, race itself is a socially constructed construct, and it's a hierarchy, and we live in this hierarchy. And the hierarchy privileges white people, and it privileges white men in that hierarchy. And then in the hierarchy, Black people and Indigenous people are really at the bottom of that hierarchy. And so if we understand this, right, then we can understand that racism is the oppression. It's the act of, oppressing people who, based on characteristics of appearance and, skin color, texture of their hair, things of that nature. It is an act, right? So this occurs at different levels. It occurs within, so at the individual level, it occurs at community level. So relationships that we hold and have with our peers, family members, community, people we work with, and at the institutional level, so where we work, right? A city, a DOT, an agency, a nonprofit, and then all of that, right? And we're talking about transportation mobility. So that is a system. You work and operate within the system, navigate both physically and politically in that system. And all of that is really shaped by race and racism. And then the systemic piece, right, is all of that is working together. And so in this way, we can understand why it's so complex, and why it is so difficult to undo, and why it takes everyday intention to dismantle, right, this apparatus, to dismantle at every single level these systems of oppression. And so if we go to the next slide, racial equity then, right, is really ensuring that everyone has what they need to be successful and thrive by taking race and the impacts of racism into account and removing those barriers. It is the intentional work of removing those barriers and not giving, but knowing that people of color have the agency to self-determine what is true and what is right and what is good for them, for us. I want to also just say a couple of things in terms of leading with racial equity. I mentioned that we at Nelson Nygaard and in this project are leading with this approach. And it is because we also understand, again, that some of the leading predictors of disparity in transportation outcomes intersect with the lived experiences of people of color and other experiences. So we aren't leading with race at the exception or exclusion of others. We are taking a very intersectional approach. And we're looking at, right, some of the disparate outcomes. But at a high level and in the work that we do at Nelson Nygaard, we see racially disparate outcomes in transportation costs, in commute times, which we know is very much tied to upward economic mobility. We see it in transit and lower frequency. We see it in transit with lower reliability. We see it in neighborhoods that don't have continuous sidewalks. Street lighting, is missing. There's not a tree canopy cover. Highway and speed arterials are often bifurcating and often have, really had devastating effects in those communities. We know that there's higher volumes of traffic, higher crash rates involving serious or fatal injuries. We also know that there's higher levels of pollution and higher levels of associated public health outcomes, disparate health outcomes. We also know that overall transportation options are lesser, and there's also less connectivity. These neighborhoods often have higher levels of police enforcement and thus higher levels of traffic-related violations, fines related to parking, driving, biking, walking. I think we've all seen, doing anything while Black, hashtags. And so in transportation, this is directly correlated. So these are the kinds of outcomes, right, that we know at a high level exist. And so these are the kinds of outcomes that we look at. Just two more slides, and then I'm going to hand it over to Laura. But the specific way in which we are examining race and then, of course, racial outcomes in the the context of San Jose is, we've really dug into history. We've been examining what is the history here, and there is a tale of two cities. We know that Jim Crow laws, we know that Federal Highway Act, urban renewal, slum clearance, eminent domain, and really access to building wealth through the GI Bill, right? Like, has really had, these are all federal programs and policies that at the local level in San Jose has really led to segregation, both residential and racial segregation, covenants, redlining, which I think we're mostly familiar with, as well as other practices. And so we have gone through the process, if you look at the next slide, where we've really started to disaggregate based on race and other demographic population or demographics, as I mentioned, what the outcomes look like today, right? And so what we see are highly unequitable communities, concentration of communities. We know that there's areas with less access and options. And so we're really digging into this information, and this is really sort of the beginning of our work. And this is us collecting information about what we think we know. And our subsequent work is really ground truthing that. So I've started to get into the project, but I just wanted to give you an overview, and I'm going to pass it over to Laura, who's really going to talk about the project overall. Thank you.
Thanks, Naomi. A lot to cover in a short amount of time. Thank you, Laura.
Hello, everyone. My name is Laura Stuchinsky, and as mentioned, I'm the lead of the city's emerging mobility program, and it's the project manager of this project. And I'm gonna, as Naomi mentioned, give you some context for the why we did this plan and how we set up the plan. There were several reasons that led the city to create an emerging mobility action plan. This is one of the reasons. This is a pre-COVID shot of traffic in our area, but traffic conditions are already starting to get worse again, even though we're not entirely out of the pandemic. Next slide. This is another factor, climate change. Like many cities, we're beginning to see extreme weather and related disasters as a result. That particularly hits some communities harder than others. And next slide. And that both of these issues are why the city adopted pretty ambitious goals to reduce single occupancy vehicle trips and increase those taken by public transit, walking, and biking. Next slide. We also thought that emerging mobility might be part of the solution. These are examples of services that are currently available in San Jose. Unfortunately, most of these services are clustered in our downtown in our high-tech center, which is north of downtown. The city has required the services that we permit to offer discount memberships for lower income residents and to station bikes and scooters in our disadvantaged neighborhoods. But most of the trips continue to be taken by people in more and more affluent areas. So with this plan, we wanted to figure out how to leverage these new transportation technologies and services to create a transportation system that would create more opportunities for everyone, not just those who can afford to take Uber and Lyft regularly. Next slide. Our conception for this plan, though, was broadened when as the city started to participate in GARE, which started in 2018. For those who aren't familiar with GARE, it's the Government Alliance on Race and Equity. It's a national organization focused on ending systemic racism. It does so by training and supporting government agencies to take leadership on racial equity within their institutions and in partnership with their communities. Next slide. This is GARE's theory of change. There's three major areas of work we need to focus on to create the communities you want. First is normalizing conversations about race. It's developing a shared language and understanding of racial equity, and clearly naming the role of government in creating and maintaining racial inequities. The second is organize, creating the internal structure and the capacity for staff to do this work and to lay the groundwork for inclusive community engagement. And the last is operationalize, using racial equity tools to identify and change policies, programs, and practices that are perpetuating inequities and setting goals in partnership with the community and measuring progress toward those goals. So I saw the Emerging Mobility Action Plan as an opportunity for our department to begin work in all three of these areas and to fundamentally rethink how we structure our planning processes how we do community engagement, and what we would really need to change in order to truly center racial and social equity in all that we do. Next slide. Doing this work required finding the right team to assist us. We were very explicit in our request for proposals about what we wanted to accomplish and why. For example, we were very clear about the fact that we were going to be centering racial equity, and specifically that we wanted to apply GEAR's racial equity tool. We wanted to push our thinking and practice around community engagement, including providing funding to pay community-based organizations, leaders, and community members to help us create the plan. And we stated our goals, which include building stronger ongoing relationships between the city and its residents, to enhance community assets and opportunities, particularly in disadvantaged communities, and to create a plan that reflects the values not just of the city, but also of the community, and to meaningfully enhance mobility, sustainably, and racial equity, and to begin to embed racial equity into all of our core operations and work plans. Next slide. We were delighted to be able to partner with an exceptional team that has extensive experience leading racial equity work, as you've heard in the introductions, and doing community engagement in San Jose's Black, Indigenous, and communities of color. We're also keenly aware that we will stumble in this process. Frameworks seem straightforward and clear, but as Sahar mentioned, processes are messy. And depending on how you handle the messes, and we've started to make messes, they can provide great opportunities for learning and for building trust. With that, I'll pass the baton over to Tamika Butler, who will share more details about how we've begun to put these ideas into practice and what we've learned so far.
I'm sorry, Laura, I'm just going to stop us for 1 second to note on the previous slide. We do also have Sam Schwartz on our team, which is not on the slide. So we have quite a team put together here, but I just want to make sure that they get noticed for that as well. Thank you. Sorry, go ahead, Tamika.
No worries. It's important to note. Thanks everybody for joining us, and thanks Laura and Naomi for kind of setting the scene and helping folks know where we are. So if we go to the next slide, I want to talk a little bit about something we're trying to conceptualize in this project, which is partnership. It's something I was brought onto the project with, you saw their information on the last slide, but Corinne Winter and her team, we've been doing this work together. And part of why I was brought on is some of the experience I have thinking through partnership. So what you're seeing now are two reports, one put out by NACDO and then one put out by me and my colleague Naomi Iwasaki, who also has her own consulting firm. And it's from a project we did this summer. And a lot of the things I'll be talking about with partnership come from this project where NACDO launched an initiative. I'm sure many folks have heard of it, the Streets for Pandemic Response and Recovery. And it was about best practices and different design guides that cities could use, but it also included a first ever rapid response program that selected 10 city teams to receive money to fund recovery responses. And different projects emerged: outdoor dining, slow streets, community or mobility hubs. But we talked about, in this recovery effort, what was the specific challenge around cities who were trying to balance rapid implementation of recovery efforts with meaningful, equitable community partnerships and shared ownership, right? And the reason I elevate this is because what we learned during the pandemic, where so many cities felt like they were in a position where they had to get things done quickly, is that those lessons should apply beyond just pandemic or pandemic recovery. And in fact, that's what we're trying to do in this project. So a couple of things that really come to mind for us. On the next slide, it's that idea that you really have to be doing engagement, not outreach. I think particularly in the transportation world, we love to do outreach. We love to go into communities and say, here's what we're going to do. What do you think? We might even give them stickers to put up on a board. But that is very different than authentically engaging and realizing that where we start, what we think we might do, may not be where we end, because it may not be what the community wants. Engagement has to recognize and build off cultural strengths and values. And it has to be not just culturally appropriate, which I think some folks say, but culturally specific, right? We go into communities, an example I always use is the food pyramid, right? And the food pyramid was this thing that we all can envision that said, eat a few things from this part, and this part. But you could go into certain communities and they could say, you're telling us to eat fruit and vegetables, but none of the fruit and vegetables from our community, from our country are part of that pyramid. So does that mean that our food is not good? Does that mean that we cannot be healthy, right?
Okay. I think,
All
oh, great. We
You're
lost
back.
you for a second, Tamika.
Okay,
It's good to
I'm
have you back,
back.
but you stopped where you were towards the end of the food pyramid.
Got it. Sorry about that, folks.
No problem.
So the food pyramid is, you know, if somebody looks at the fruit and vegetable section and says none of the fruits and vegetables from my culture are here, are we telling them that they are inherently wrong or incapable of being healthy, right? And so when we think about how do we engage with folks, we have to do things in culturally specific ways. We have to trust local leadership, and we also have to be authentic and be who we are and not try to be someone else, right? Folks think that doing equity work means saying yes all the time, but it means being transparent and being honest and building trust. If we go to the next slide, we'll see that when you're developing these partnerships, you have to understand that all partnerships aren't created equal. You can't create a partnership and just say, well, now we've done it, check that box, right? Like, you have to understand that the best situation are strong community partnerships. And for those of us who work, whether or not we're consultants, whether or not we're academics, or whether or not we work at cities, we have to understand that our work has to be strong behind the scenes. We have to coordinate together, because if not, if we have strong community partnerships but weak coordination behind the scenes, that's when we end up in situations where we're asking community members to show up to 3 different meetings, but we're asking them very similar questions, right? That's where community members are constantly feeling like we're extracting information from them, but we're not actually using it and we're not collaborating with them. And we can't have no community partnerships, right? No community partnerships is definitely the worst. And so as we think about how do you incorporate equity through partnership, on the next slide, a few things that we figured out both with this NACTO project, but that we're instituting in the San Jose project. We want to define and commit to equity yesterday, right? We know that this work is already too late in some respects. And so we have to be conscious about committing and defining equity for us as a collective, right? We have to know, I always share the story of a researcher at a university in the Midwest who said equity is like the color blue. And if we don't define it upfront together, then everyone's saying blue, but in their mind, they're seeing a totally different color. We also have to understand, where are the pressure points for our community, right? Where are the pressure points for those of us on the team? Where can there be sources of support? Where's the political or popular support? Where is the objection? And what could derail our efforts, both internally for those, again, on the project team, but also externally for stakeholders? I think one thing we learned in the pandemic that we are trying to carry on beyond the pandemic in the San Jose project is not waiting for a crisis to develop partnerships, right? We have to know, when you think about something like the way the vote turned out in a place like Georgia, that didn't happen overnight. That was because of partnerships and work put in well before the election. And so we have to think the same way about our partnerships. We also have to not be afraid to have conversations about capacity up front, right? Any high functioning team has clear roles and has to have an honest understanding of each team member's strengths, weaknesses, areas for growth. And it's no different when you're talking about working with community partners. And then we have to be honest about what we have to do to position community members as project and program leads, and then paying them well to do it. And in this project, that includes things like, literally, how do we pay people? What is the bureaucratic process, right? I'm on another project where the types of checks we write are not easy to cash at a same day, paycheck casher. And you have to be able to call the number on the check, but the number on the check isn't for the local firm, it's for the national office of the firm, where they don't always answer the phone in the evenings Pacific time. But these are things that sometimes we have to think through, the big parts, the flashy parts that happen in front of everybody, but also the logistics behind the scene. The last thing I'll share is that we really have to understand power. Too often in these situations, we think of power as being someone like a sword that we can wield, right? And instead, we have to understand that these relationships, when we partner with community, there are going to be power dynamics. And those of us who have more power, we have to shift and we have to share that power. We have to stop thinking about our work as being an empowerment framework where we have the power we're going to bestow on people, but a co-powerment framework where we're working together. And just to give you a visual of how this looks for us, on this next slide, you'll see that we are really trying to elevate community voices, and building partnerships is essential to the work we're doing in San Jose. We are trying to achieve authentic, true collaboration, and we're leaning on several different committees. We have a TAC, we have a PAC, right? These acronyms that a lot of folks understand, but at the top and at the center of that is our equity task force. And our equity task force is huge. You know, we are really, really trying to center BIPOC communities. And there is this tension in working with the equity task force around budget, around scope, around how to be inclusive. But we prioritize racial identities and people's ability to reach out to different folks, young folks, older folks, you know, API folks, Black folks, folks who have housing instability. And we try to create a balance between being targeted, but also being inclusive. And then we had to realize that we were going to build these relationships on a continuum, right? That the way we started isn't going to be where we ended, and everybody's relationship wasn't going to progress at the same rate. But as the consultants and as the city, we had to keep working through it, right? And we had to be interested in deep conversations and learn that there are multiple truths to how people are experiencing the same city, San Jose, and how we invest resources might look different to them. And we have to understand that when you do all of this, it's novel. And sometimes that when you're doing something novel, it can be more nimble, but sometimes it's not more nimble. Sometimes, you know, the members of our task force feel like the reporting or the coming back, what does that look like? But I think the true value of this work is that we are committed to making transportation be part of every conversation. And I think that's it for slides. I might have one more, but I think, you know, the reason I wanted to share this slide, in our last meeting with the Equity Task Force, we started off in a way that we plan to start most of our meetings, which was just asking, where are people at? How are you doing? And so it would be remiss for me to show up to this space and not acknowledge that we're, you know, San Jose is a city with a very diverse population, including a huge population of Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders and folks of API descent. And we have many of those folks on our task force, right? And so whether or not it's an anniversary of Japanese internment, or whether or not we're just a few days out from seeing misogyny and racism take lives in Atlanta, we know that those things are in our mind. We have committee members who are saying we can't talk to people about why they're not using transit or emerging mobility if we can't talk to them about how scared they are to go outside because someone might perpetuate a hate crime against them. And so these are the things that centering community allows us to do. But again, true engagement and not just outreach means that we may have a whole agenda all about emerging mobility. But if we need to hold space where we're not just going to expect people to show up, whether or not it's to a conference or a meeting, and not talk about their experience in this world and how they are living and how they might have fear, or how their memberships or the people who we're expecting them to outreach to might have other things on their mind, then we're not doing our best work. And so just bringing it full circle to what Naomi said, that's part of the reason we're centering race, right? Because we know that even though our mission is to talk about, you know, urbanism and technology and emerging mobility and transit and how all of these things overlap for the people of San Jose, at the end of the day, they're people. And they're people who are living in this world we're all living in, where we're all just expected to show up and keep going like nothing's happening. And we have to create space in our community partnerships to acknowledge that the killing of Asian folks is wrong, the killing of Black folks is wrong, and we can't talk about transportation without tying those things together. And so with that, I think we have one more slide with our contact information. I will note my contact information is wrong, but I'll put it in the chat. But I will pass it back to our lovely moderator.
Thank you, Tamika and Laura and Naomi. There's so much here, and I'm just reminded every time we all get together of how fortunate I feel to be involved in this process with you all and with the community. As you can see, this is a complicated subject and a complicated project, but the reality is that if we don't pay attention to the complexity, we are not actually achieving any of our goals. And not really paying attention to the community. So with that, I wanted to dive into some of the points you discussed. We do have a Q&A period as well. So I'd like to encourage folks to go ahead and start putting their questions into the little Q&A box. That way I can stop asking my questions when we see some of your questions and let you all take the lead here. So as we're starting to populate the Q&A box, I'll just get us started. So, you know, I think Tamika talked a little bit about the change that can happen in a true engagement process, maybe even a true empowerment process as we start to think about the engagement spectrum that goes from outreach to true empowerment and co-creation. But sometimes there's what you called saying yes all the time mentality. I like that when we're working on equity issues in particular. That can prevent certain kinds of investments or certain changes, right? So there's various reasons that community members may be resistant to potential shifts in projects, and some of that can do with mistrust. Some of that can do with you know, like you said, other issues that are going on that make you think, you know, why would I care about this project right now? And some, yeah. I think, you know, that's a really important experience to note. And I think that, you know, I don't want to get on a soapbox, but I also think that sometimes we think about the ability to compartmentalize different types of work and different types of life experiences through a very white lens. And that's not always an option for people. And I don't know that it should be how we focus anyway. But anyway, I think, you know, I want to talk a little bit about the tension between that as well as the traditional way we've done planning and projects, which is to listen to the loudest voice in the room, right, and respond to that. So how do we deal with that kind of tension? How do we strike a balance between the typical louder neighborhood constituency or community voices that are generally involved in these process and their needs versus the people that we're trying to talk more to and engage more in the process and co-create with, and the responses that we may have to some of the issues that are brought up by them. We want to make it not a zero-sum game. So I wonder if you guys can talk about some of the strategies to move that forward. And I'll just open it up, but I don't know if someone wants to start.
I'm happy to jump in first and say, I mean, I know that Naomi and I would probably say some of the same things. So I won't say much. I'll just, before passing it over to her, I'll start by saying something that you just said. We have to switch this mindset from a scarcity mindset to an abundance mindset, because I think that is what happens. And again, that's whether or not we're talking about transportation or whether or not we're talking about racial justice. I think in the last few days, seeing, you know, folks trying to pit the API community and the Black community against each other, or the Latinx community and the API community against each other. We've built this narrative that there's only so much, and if someone gets something, they're hurting you, right? And I think that is, we have to just change that mindset. We have to realize that there is an abundance, and that we have to be willing to say, like, some people are going to get some stuff. Now, that is not saying that there won't be situations where somebody getting something means you don't get something. But we also have to get okay with that, because oftentimes when we're trying to do this equity work, whether or not we're talking about power or resources, we're trying to redistribute based on past harms. And I think that's something we're trying to hold seriously, hold space for in the San Jose project. That, yeah, there might be some places that get something and some places that don't, but that's probably because some places have gotten a lot for a long time and some places haven't.
I'll keep it real short because I know Laura is going to have a lot maybe to say, just being at an agency. But I think this this idea, like, it's kind of like, I'm gonna make a joke of it. It's not funny, but like the idea that there could be too much equity or too much justice or too much joy. When you say it like that, it's kind of like, oh, no, I want all of that, you know? And I think that it's really important, this abundance piece, because we've always been taught that it's like limited amount of budget, limited amount of scope. But this continuum that we're talking about, like if you're looking to build relationship and the idea, right, and the intention that you set, and then the follow through that you show, the impact that that will have, right? Intention, follow through, like not the one statement, but like the whole spectrum of this work. It leads to transparency. It leads to real trust, right? It leads to the ability to communicate, right, in a way that is with love, with care, like you would with a family member that you hopefully can speak to in that way. But the point is that I don't think, I mean, I don't know. I mean, maybe there's like someone out there that would say, no, that's too much joy, or, you know, cut me off at, you know, this point for justice. Fine, there might be some of those folks, but I would say the most people want to see a better world and want to see better outcomes and want to see their communities and loved ones and people thrive. And I think if we could really get comfortable with like framing that and setting those intentions and following up, and then really like tracking, right, and saying here's like what this result is, I think that we can do this. That's why I'm in this work. So pass it over.
Great. Laura, did you have anything to add?
Just in a practical, I mean, just when I started writing this grant proposal, I was wrestling with the fact that historically we have always done everything so that every district gets the same amount, which is you can't pursue racial equity if you keep giving everybody the same amount. So when we're just, there's some things we've decided to do that, for example, in doing the community engagement, we are focusing on communities of color and low-income communities, not exclusively, but we're doing a heavy focus there. And there are some things like in our survey, we'll be spreading around the entire city, but we know that there are certain populations that we have heard from repeatedly in the past, and we will hear from again. And the point is to try to find the voices and amplify those that haven't been heard. And so that we have a clear picture about what's happening in our community and then can respond in a more thoughtful way. And thankfully, these conversations are also happening at the city council level. So we're starting to talk more about race and realize that it can't be the same old if we're going to actually do something different.
Thank you. And I think that what you are all sort of alluding to and discussing in one way is how this project is building a framework and a trusting foundation and a path to do things less reactively. I think, you know, San Jose has strong leadership that's happy to talk about this and is ready to implement some of this work. I do think that sometimes we have situations where there's political backlash against some of this. And so what I'm hearing from Tamika and Naomi and Laura is sort of, and you know, what we've been doing on the project is creating those relationships and that pathway so that we can stop being reactive, so that we already have the systems in place to work with community and sort of combat that political backlash before it's even an issue, which is a longer game. Game is the wrong word, but you know, it's a longer process. And so I just want to acknowledge that there are political hurdles for some places, unfortunately, in doing some of this work, but they can be overcome. And I think that's part of this. I am seeing a question. Excellent. So we have a question from our audience that says, what is the starting point for agencies where white leadership is feeling a combination of overwhelmed, paralysis, or resistance to equity work because it is a new initiative, and therefore relying on the POC staff to take care of this checkbox because now it's required? So they're not actively joining in talks like this and are thinking of it more as a box to check. The commenter also says, I feel like there is space for white allies to support in this regard. So perhaps Laura, you want to start this portion because it's thinking about sort of leadership and agency internalized issues.
I mean, I think that's part of there's a group inside the city that's from multiple departments working, who've gone through GARE, and others who are interested, who now the doors are not just GARE. And we're having conversations internally about noticing where our practice, even though we're committed to doing racial equity work, has fallen short. And I think to do this work, particularly the white people in the group, need to be committed to looking at where we're falling short, what we're not seeing, so that everyone can be participating, but not leaning on people of color who have always had to do this in their personal lives all the time, and then have to come to work and be fighting the same battles and feeling isolated and not supported. So it requires white people to be looking at how the assumptions that we have, that we walk around with all the time and are not realizing that they cause harm.
Thank you, Laura. Tamika or Naomi, did you have anything to add on that one?
I'll just say I just had this conversation with my white partner yesterday, and something I shared with her is that it has to be every day. And I think sometimes white folks forget that. Like, as folks of color, like this is just every day. Like, if you think it's overwhelming and you have paralysis, like it's like, I can have sympathy for you, I guess, but like this is just everyday work. And something we were talking about is sometimes the way that white folks think there are only two extremes, that you have to confront the folks who aren't doing the work, have really uncomfortable conversations with them, and that make you feel bad. And it's like, it's this horrible, like really really memorable incident in your life or in your week or in your day, or you just are like, you know what, I'm just going to cut them off because they're not it. And like, it's neither one of those, like those extremes. Like, yeah, sometimes you have to do both of those things, but the real work happens somewhere in the middle, where every day you're calling people in, every day you're sending an email, every day you're asking yourself, what am I going to change today? Every day you're checking in on folks, right? Like every day you're doing this constant work. And so I think this is a place, not just for white allies, but I would say white accomplices. And for me, I always say that the difference with an accomplice is they're willing to risk something. They're really to lose something. They're just not playing it safe, right? They're just not only speaking up in the meeting that's designated the meeting about equity. They're speaking up in the meeting about engineering, in the meeting about filling potholes, in the meeting about the marketing campaign. They're speaking up in all of those spaces, even if it feels like it makes them vulnerable. It makes them like a target for people not liking them. And so I would just encourage white allies to think about what they want to do to become white accomplices, and realize that this is everyday work and you just have to keep at it.
Thanks, Tamika. Very well said. Naomi?
Nothing to add there.
Well, we have a follow-up question that is related, which is, as BIPOC professionals, how do you deal with the fatigue of being relied on so heavily to tackle these challenges? Anyone want to take that one?
I mean, I'll start, and it's hard. Feel free to chime in because I know you've led a lot of equity work as well. It is. How do you deal with the fatigue? I sometimes turn off my phone so that I can have just alone time, because as my title implies, like I am doing this work every day, and I'm not only doing it with our internal team and staff and leadership, right? I'm doing this with clients, this work with clients, and then you have days like Tuesday where you just like that violence that took place in Atlanta. The last location was a few blocks away from, well, it was like a mile away from where my parents live. And I had been so busy throughout the day, I didn't realize. But once I did and I started tuning in, it's like, you can't help but start to just feel like, wow, like the, intersection of like racism and patriarchy and gender, you know, like really came to the fore, and you just have to time out, and try to recharge, and you check in with people, as Tamika said. Yeah, I mean, it's not easy. I guess that's the bottom line. But because I love like myself, and I love my family, and I love being Latinx, I love my people, I love my friends. Like this is the work I chose, and this is the work I do. So that's what kind of keeps it going. And the fact that I can do it in transportation is a huge privilege, and I see that and I recognize that. And my goal is to really support, other emerging leaders and planners to be able to do this kind of intersectional thinking and work as well. So.
Yeah, and the thing I say on almost every panel that I'm on, that I'll keep saying, is BIPOC folks, we don't have to set ourselves on fire to keep other people warm. Like, it's not always our job to do that work, right? And I think I tweeted this the other day as I was watching the Bachelor finale, but also like watching like the Harry and Meghan interview. Like, I think there are all these instances where white folks feel like they're learning a lot, right? Like, I think some of the racial reckoning we've had to do in recent months, in the recent year, has allowed white folks who haven't had to interact with this every day to see some things that they haven't had to see before, and has allowed them to feel like, wow, this is a learning experience for me. And I think sometimes as folks of color, we think, well, we have to put ourselves out there, and we have to be vulnerable, and we have to cry on national TV or in a staff meeting or send the fiery email, but so that my colleagues can learn. And I will say that sometimes we do, and sometimes we do that, and sometimes we willfully tokenize ourselves because we care about this work, and we're passionate about this work. And we know that there are so few of us that if we don't say something, like, who's going to say it? But I think we also have to give ourselves permission that it's not our work to do this for everybody else all the time. And we really, really, really don't have to set ourselves on fire to keep other people warm. We get to protect some of that. We get to decide when it's the right time for us. And I also tell everybody on every panel I'm on this to follow the Nat Ministry on social media, because it's, a Black woman who's talking about the power and the revolution and the fight of rest, of giving ourselves permission to say, not today. Today I'm going to take a nap, and that's okay.
Thank you. I don't really have anything to add to those amazing things, except maybe thinking about flipping the question a little bit in terms of how can we support the people doing this work. And I think there's a lot of mechanisms for that too, including allowing an opportunity to rest and valuing that opportunity to rest. But some of the things we've tried to do with this project in particular is first ensuring that we are paying people for their time, ensuring that we are working around their capacity, and valuing the input that we do receive, so that it's not a box that we check, but rather really driving the project. That being said, I think, as Naomi and Tamika have noted, this is work that BIPOC communities are doing every minute of their lives, whether it's external or internal. It's just a part of being part of that community, or those communities. And so I think that it is really important to be able to shut off, and to be able to be, away from it, whenever whenever you can and you need to be, and especially in those really traumatizing moments. There's so much trauma in our world right now around these issues, always, but really being highlighted right now. And so I just want to acknowledge that. I think we have time for one more quick question. So I would like to just ask the team, what is, to date, one of the most challenging aspects of going from the racial equity framework that we discussed around GARE, or others that may be used, to the actual application of it in a project? And can you talk a little bit about how you're addressing that? I know we only have about 2 minutes left, so I'll just back off. Laura, do you want to get us started on that one?
Well, I know Naomi was trying to tell me over and over in the beginning that there's a really big difference between the theory the concepts that Gere has established with their racial equity framework, which are all really good, she would affirm, but it's really different when you apply them to a planning process, which is iterative. I mean, and also the tool is used iterative, but and the team was trying to come up with another way of conceptualizing it, and I just was having a hard time wrapping my brain around it. So we had many conversations about how do you go from theory to practice, and I'm still learning. So I'll turn it over to Naomi to give more of a sense about how she's been trying to help me learn.
Yeah, I think I think it's just so baked in our thinking as planners and in our education, right? In a culture space that is based on white supremacy, right? Like we have sort of like a starting point and an end point and a timeline, and like it's so linear. And I can just say, being Latinx, and Spanish was my first language, and it's such a circular language. And sometimes I equate like racial equity with like that thought process where you start one place and you go kind of around it, and then you come back to it, like you're still talking about it, right? And you're still you're doing it, but it's just it's like you come back to it and you're just refining. And I think Sahar and I have called it loops in iteration, which I think, design thinking is some of that. And so I think there are some equations, but once community is involved, right, and you're really getting into it with racial equity, there's just pause, right? There's time that you need to give. There's things that come up, as Tamika mentioned. So I'll leave it there if anyone wants to add or close it out.
Yeah, I would just add that, and we've all said this in one way or another before, but you can't be so afraid to make a mistake that you do nothing, right? Like our work is not neutral. And so if you're not working to fix the racism and white supremacy and inequities that transportation has helped to perpetuate over centuries in our country, if you're not doing work to actively dismantle that and change it, then you're helping it and you're keeping it going. And so we have to realize that I think sometimes, especially in today's world, people are so afraid to say the wrong thing or make a mistake. And you just kind of have to get in there and figure it out. And you can't just rely on the BIPOC folks to figure it out for you. Like you just can't pop into a room and be like, tell me what to do, people of color, right? Like as people of color, we don't just pop in rooms and say, white people tell me everything. Like we got to figure it out. And so don't be so afraid to get something wrong or to say the wrong thing that you do nothing at all.
Thanks, Tamika. I'm just laughing at that image. I'm very visual, so I am seeing that over and over in my head, and it's hilarious. I do want to thank everyone for being here today. Thank our amazing panel for all of their insight and continuing work. This is our contact information. We did get a question about how to follow this project, and just to let everyone know, this project is being posted as things continue to develop on movesanjose.org. We are still working on that, so it'll continue to come up, but we're working with the community to figure out exactly what the best method of keeping ourselves accountable is too, so you can follow along there. I don't know, Laura, if there's another format that you want to recommend.
I think that's the best way on the San Jose Moves website. Yeah. Moves
Great. Excellent. Well, thanks again to our amazing panelists, Laura, Tamika, Naomi. This has been such a pleasure to be in this space with all of you and all of our attendees as well. Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Bye. Thanks, Amanda, too. Bye.
Oh, yes, and Amanda.
Thanks, Amanda. Bye, folks.
Thanks, everybody.